So, Austin, we've covered some great ground, and you've offered some really, really great tips. What's really clear is that there are so many synergies, and in fact, even more than I probably thought of. So, this has been absolutely great. Just moving on a little bit, we talked lots about proactive communication. Something that's obviously big in all of our worlds is crisis management and crisis communications. I actually started my career in the aviation sector, so kind of crisis comms is something hardwired from that sector for sure. Um, so during a crisis, we obviously think of a lot of different stakeholders. We have to think about your internal audience as well as your external audience. We need to make sure messages are consistent, and empathetic and all that stuff. I'd love to know your take on what that means from an analyst perspective, because when I remember studying a PR degree back in the day, and everything around crisis management was the cycle of a crisis. It starts as an issue, something blows up, and then there's the fallout, the share price crashes, the company might lose a ton of share price, market share, may get acquired, hostile takeover. It's almost like the perfect life cycle. So, like, to what extent, from your perspective, do you see that cycle, and kind of what's the analyst take on crises?
Yeah. No, it's a good question, and like thankfully the crises that we deal with aren't quite as devastating as like something in the aviation field, or we're in B2B tech most often, so it's not as devastating, but it still affects the bottom line. It still affects the stock price, the perception of the company, all of those things. Um, so I think where analysts play is like it you reap the rewards of your analyst engagement when there is a crisis. Like, you have built all of this goodwill with them, so they now trust your perspective, because whenever this crisis happens, this analyst is likely going to field, tons of calls from your buyers saying, what is going on with X vendor? What is going on with X vendor? Should I cut them? Should I buy new? Or, what's the story here? And ideally, you have a relationship with them, to where you can get ahead of them and explain it, and they believe you because you've been honest with them in the past. You've been vulnerable. You've given them sort of a look behind the curtain on your company and who you are. So I think that's where it really comes in, is that long-term relationship with them to where they trust you. And now when that angry customer is calling them, they can say, hey, actually, I know the CEO really well. He gave me a call to let me know that this was coming. And it was, like,
Mhm.
while not ideal, I do trust that they have it and you should stay with them. So I think that's how crisis communication typically plays out in the analyst world, and when best in class can really mitigate the situation.
Completely agree. And again, huge similarities when you come to other stakeholders, like reporters, for example. The way I like to think about it is, to your point, having those positive relationships, in peacetime, as it were, are so important. It's almost like, you think about it as a bank account. You've got a
Yeah,
savings account. Actually, you've got a lot of credit in the bank. So, when something happens, you've got that buffer, and you've got those relationships already established. So many times, in my career, we're brought in as communicators once everything is sort of out there, and you've already lost you're already behind the curve at that
right.
point. You're trying, you can't expect to be building those kind of relationships at that point, when the sky's falling down, and there's 5 million things going on. So there's a lot of similarities there. And the example I think about, was I'm talking about IT meltdowns, but in the aviation world, the winter chaos of Southwest,
Yeah,
in the winter of 22. And they really went through it, but actually, they really stood firm through it, because it's Southwest and they treat people well, and they have a good reputation. Generally speaking, there's obviously challenges and issues, but actually, and that relationship, that reputation had been built over decades.
yeah,
And so there's a lot of similarities there.
yeah,
And then, in terms of, I mean, the other element, of course, of crisis management is making sure that you've got your issues management down on pat, and you are horizon scanning. And you know so many crises obviously come from a place where they were foreseen or they were an issue. How can PR teams work with analyst teams in some of that horizon scanning and crisis preparation piece?
Yeah. I think it's probably one of the most like underused tactic for even a lot of AR professionals, to be honest, is like just asking an analyst, like, what are you hearing from my customers? What are they saying about me? Like, I've heard so many crazy things pop up in those calls where it's like, yeah, like your sales team is one of the most ruthless out there. People just dislike working with you. Or, we've heard this sort of thing. Like, there's so much that can bubble up because, like, we really see the analyst as a proxy to the market. So like any time that you get a chance to ask them, like it's worth it. Like hopefully the answer is like, oh no, we hear all good things, but like that's a really good sort of quick voice of the customer and the market, without having to do a ton of work and research.
Yeah, that's the other thing. It's a whole nother ecosystem of feedback and insights that you might not otherwise get. And I can imagine there's a lot of, to your point, there's a lot of, commentary that might surface in some of those circles that, next thing you know, you're reading about it, in the Wall Street Journal. And then you're in kind of damage limitation mode. And obviously then it's a very different picture, of course.
Yeah. The other thing we've started to do a lot is like customer review sites, like depending what sort of market you're on, but we'll analyze like all these G2 reviews for these companies of thousands, and like the findings are pretty funny sometimes, where it's like your this feature functionality is way off, or your customer satisfaction is like way behind the competition, and there's some like really good sensors in there all sitting out there for us.
How do you see through some of, because obviously you hear a lot about fake reviews, and particularly now in the age of I would imagine that problem is only going to become more acute. Sort of how do you see through some of those issues when you're trying to come up with a real sort of honest, authentic assessment of a product or a market?
Yeah, it's a great question, and like I don't know, we like it is a real challenge, and like I think our stance is like the companies that are doing that are the ones that really have to fight it. But I still stand by, like, a lot of the analyst firms do this, and we do this too. But like still having a person on the call with like your customer actually talking to the analyst is still the most powerful like play in our playbook that we have. So like even in the world of AI and all of the things, like there is still the human to human connection of like, hey, we have our tier one customer who wants to talk to you. Like, would you like to ask them some questions for research or whatever? So we do that quite a bit, and it's like still one of our most best run plays.
That's interesting. So, and that's a really important addition to what we were talking about earlier in terms of data and some of those insights. Actually, having the voice of the customer. It's interesting you were talking about NDAs earlier, because I was reflecting on that. And for many of our clients, they have commercial agreements, which mean they can't talk about the work they're doing
Right.
with the customer, which could be a challenge. Although on instances where we've been able to kind of bring in the voice of a customer in the media, that could be hugely interesting, and obviously brings all the credibility and that sort of extra voice that we've been talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it adds a ton of credibility, and like the NDA thing is interesting. Like it feels a lot more like prominent in your world. Like I think we sort of get away like a lot of like inquiries and things are naturally under NDA because you're paying for them. But yeah, no, we customer interviews like, but it's also incredibly difficult to get a customer willing to talk, to your point. Like everyone's busy, all these things. Like why would they take their time to sort of tell their story? But
Mm. Well, I think in our world, if you can curate a really compelling opportunity, and you position it in a way that it is truly a win-win.
yeah,
And to a point we've been talking earlier, it's strategic, it's on message, it's gonna help move the needle in some way. Then actually that's where you can make that persuasion. But it's almost building in my experience, it's almost like building a bespoke opportunity for a certain customer with a certain target. So it feels very personal. And then what it means is you can kind of curate something together.
yeah.
So you can really work together on the messaging. You can, agree who the target is. And it just kind of means people are a lot more involved, and I think have more skin in the game. And that could be one way where that works well.